Complete series. Below is the price of $500,000 if taking care of the female lead. I impersonated my brother to care for his blind fiancée. The day she recovered her sight, I didn't say a word and left. We met again at a business interview. I had become an intern reporter, and she had transformed into the powerful miss of the White family. Receiving interviews from the press. I heard that during her illness. Fortunately, Mr. Foster, her fiancé, never left her side. The two of them are about to have their wedding soon, aren't they? Her lips curved into a soft smile. She raised her hand, showing off the ring, and nodded. He and I are getting engaged soon. Her gaze, deliberately or not, fell on me standing in the corner of the room. Before the interview started, the entire hall buzzed with chatter. The young lady being interviewed today is the one who holds power over the entire White family. I heard 5 years ago she went blind, and was even expelled from the White family. If it weren't for her devoted fiancé who stayed by her side, she probably wouldn't be alive today. Keep your voice down. I sat nearby, forcing a smile, my nails digging deep into my palms. Suddenly, Mr. Zhang, my senior colleague, turned around. Vivian Foster. Go pour me some water, will you? I had just reached the water dispenser by the exit, when the large door was suddenly pushed open. Someone walked in. My mind went completely blank. 3 years. The changes in Caroline White were almost completely transformative. Her once slender frame had become tall and striking. Her facial features had softened too. Excuse me, she said flatly. Her eyes swept over me, as if looking at a complete stranger. Without a trace of recognition, she walked onto the stage escorted by several bodyguards. As she passed by me, I stood frozen, stunned for several seconds. Then suddenly realized, the 2 years I spent with her were Caroline White's darkest days. She'd been thrown out of the White family. Her eyes had gone blind from a car accident. So of course she had no idea what I looked like. That's probably for the best. When I returned with the water, the interview had already begun. Caroline White sat on stage, calmly surveying the entire hall. She was answering questions about business. Suddenly the side door of the stage was pushed open. Philip Foster walked in, smiling at Caroline White. Sorry, Caroline. The film crew had some issues. I'm running late. He adjusted his vest and sat down beside Caroline White. The hall fell silent for a moment. Then the atmosphere immediately became lively and warm. Mr. Zhang held his cup of water, tilting his head to look at me. As if discovering a new continent. Vivian Foster. Not to be rude, but you really do look like Philip Foster. I pressed my lips together, forcing a smile. He's a major movie star. You're giving me too much credit. Of course we look alike. Because he and I are biological siblings. I heard that during her illness. Fortunately, Mr. Foster stayed by her side and never left. The two of them are about to have their wedding soon, aren't they? My throat went dry. I looked at Caroline White on stage. She smiled, her lips curving, raising her hand to show off her left ring finger. Wearing a simple silver ring. The ring I had struggled to buy back then to make her happy. I had saved so hard for it. The noble miss of the White family. Wearing such a cheap ring. It looked so out of place. Her fingertip gently brushed over it. Yes. He and I are getting engaged soon, she said, her gaze sweeping across the audience below. Deliberately or not, landing on me in the corner of the room. Just a few brief seconds before pulling away. The microphone was passed to Philip Foster. Mr. Foster. I heard you're currently filming director Lucas Bay's movie. He rarely uses new actors. Did Executive Director White have something to do with that? He smiled and admitted, of course. I've always been confident in my professional abilities. But I also can't deny. Caroline has really done so much for me. I'm completely worthy of this affection. His attitude natural and straightforward. Won even more praise from everyone. Someone asked, could you tell us about when you two were going through difficult times and overcame them together? Philip Foster's bright smile suddenly froze. In the strange silence, time seemed to slow down until finally, Caroline White smiled faintly and took the microphone. There's nothing to tell. His and my memories only need The two of us to know. My eyes suddenly burned, gripping the pen in my hand tightly. I panicked and lowered my head. Because the moment I closed my eyes, I remembered the teenage Caroline White from before. Because of her stubborn and unyielding personality, she had offended quite a few people. So when Caroline White fell from grace, someone deliberately came to cause trouble. To protect her, I was pushed down the stairs, falling until my entire body was covered in blood. They panicked and ran away. I gritted my teeth and stood up, pretending nothing had happened, walking back to her side. Let's go home. Caroline White suddenly grabbed my hand. You're hurt. We need to go to the hospital. I'm fine. I can smell the blood. Her voice suddenly rose. Tears fell, rolling down from those clouded eyes. She called out my brother's name. Philip. When I get better, I'll give you the most magnificent wedding in the world. After the interview ended, the sky had darkened completely. Outside the hall, rain fell in a light drizzle. Mr. Zhang patted his pockets and ordered me again. Vivian Foster. I left the memory card in there. Go back and get it for me. I stepped onto the wet ground, running quickly. The elevator floors jumped, the doors opened. I collided with two people inside. Philip Foster was tilting his head slightly, making small talk about filming with Caroline White. Though her expression was cold, she listened very patiently, their posture intimate. Seeing me, Philip Foster's expression immediately became extremely ugly. Sorry. I mumbled an apology, turning to take the stairs instead. Caroline White spoke behind me. Stop. I froze in place. Aren't you going to use the elevator? Come in. I slowly turned around, deliberately lowering my voice. Thank you, Ms. White. She told me to use the elevator, but refused to move aside, just staring at me intently. You were also a reporter at today's interview. Why didn't I hear you ask any questions? I lowered my eyes. Ms. White. I just graduated and returned to the States. I'm still an intern reporter. I don't have the right to ask questions yet. I see. She nodded lightly, not sure what she was thinking. Philip Foster beside her shot me a vicious glance. Speaking up. Let's hurry. Caroline still has to meet Lucas Bay and everyone else tonight. Caroline White finally withdrew her gaze. Let's go. I stood alone in the ascending elevator, my soul shaken. After my parents divorced, my father brought Philip Foster to squeeze into the Chu family, becoming a live-in son-in-law. For as long as I could remember, I hadn't seen Philip Foster. 5 years ago, he suddenly found me. I'll give you 500,000. You take on my identity and help me take care of someone. At that time, my mother had just died from illness. The family owed a large debt. I had no other choice, so I agreed. When we met, I learned the person he wanted me to care for was Miss of the White family, Caroline White, who had also just gotten engaged to him not long ago. His fiancée had just been in an accident. A blind woman who was also a wealthy wife. Who would want to take care of her? His face showed disgust. If he wasn't worried about his reputation, he would have broken off the engagement long ago. At that time, Philip Foster had just entered the industry, landing a pretty good film role. His career was on the rise. Afraid of being called heartless and ungrateful, so he threw this grueling job at me. Caroline White had smooth sailing for 18 years, then suddenly met with disaster. Her temperament became terrible. During the early days of taking care of her, I was constantly mocked and treated coldly by her. I was being paid to do a job, so I never argued back. Until that day I went to visit my mother's grave, and came home a little late. She started lashing out again. Philip, don't put on an act in front of me. Don't think I don't know that deep down you're disgusted by me. You're just afraid of what people will say. The rest of her words never made it out, because I suddenly leaned down and kissed her. It was actually my first kiss, completely without technique, and because it carried a hint of fear, it felt more like animals tearing at each other. Caroline White suddenly went silent. Even her ears flushed bright red, with a touch of cruelty. I bit her lip lightly, then pulled back slightly, bracing my hands on her shoulders, breathing heavily. Can you feel it now? Still think I'm disgusted by you? I took the memory card downstairs to find Mr. Zhang. He was very pleased. Vivian Foster, you're quite diligent. There's a party tonight. I'll take you to meet some people, as a reporter. Your network is very important. I hurriedly thanked him. But when we arrived, I was in the parking lot, when I saw that familiar black Rolls-Royce, and suddenly froze. Ms. White and her group are here tonight too. Mr. Zhang turned around and winked at me. I brought you specifically to Ms. White's party. Vivian Foster, don't underestimate Mr. Zhang's network. It was too late for regrets now. I could only grit my teeth and follow him inside. Fortunately, the room was quite large. Small-time reporters like us weren't seated anywhere near Caroline White and her party. Mr. Zhang introduced me to quite a few industry veterans. This is our company's new hire this year. A sharp young man. His name is Vivian Foster. Vivian, say hello to everyone. New people have to make toasts. By the end I was dizzy from drinking. I barely managed to apologize. Then covered my mouth and ran to the bathroom. Threw up until my vision went dark. I rinsed my mouth, then splashed cold water on my face before stepping out. The hallway lights glowed dim and amber. By the window in the shadows stood a familiar silhouette. My heart pounded violently. I wanted to pretend I hadn't seen her and turn back. But after taking just one step, Caroline White spoke from behind me. Word by word, her voice seemed woven through with countless complex emotions. Vivian Foster's footsteps stopped right where they were. I swallowed hard, hearing footsteps slowly approaching. Instinctively closing my eyes, the footsteps stopped in front of me. That familiar scent drawing closer bit by bit. I opened my eyes, meeting her deep, penetrating gaze. Ms. White. I tensed up, my throat tightening. Lowering my voice. How do you know my name? She said nothing, just stared at me for half a minute. Before straightening up. Your senior took you around making toasts to everyone. The whole room knows what your name is. Thinking of Mr. Zhang's booming voice. My face suddenly burned hot. I didn't mean any harm. My senior is very good to us newcomers. Maybe his enthusiasm got a little carried away. If we disturbed Ms. White's mood, I apologize. I carefully chose my words to explain, afraid of implicating Mr. Zhang, while also apologizing to her. Caroline White said nothing more. Under the warm amber lights, she narrowed her eyes slightly, looking at me with an expression halfway between a smile and something else. In reporter Foster's eyes, I must seem like quite the calculating person, don't I? I lowered my head, saying quietly, that's not what I meant. The next second, a gold-plated business card was held out before me. You're still an intern, aren't you? There's a job opportunity, want to give it a try? When I returned, my head was still spinning. The moment I stepped through the door, Mr. Zhang pulled me aside. You okay, Vivian Foster? I rubbed my aching stomach, speaking softly. Sorry, Mr. Zhang. I had stomach surgery before. I can't drink much. He frowned, about to say something, when his gaze swept downward, landing on the gold-plated business card in my hand. His eyes widened in disbelief. Is that Ms. White's personal business card? I nodded, thinking back to the scene just moments ago. That was the legendary personal card worth its weight in gold. It meant direct contact with her personally. Nothing comes without a price. I looked up warily, not forgetting to disguise my voice. An opportunity this valuable. Ms. White, why would she give it to a nobody? A small-time reporter like me? She smiled faintly. Probably because she finds you easy on the eyes. That was such a Caroline White reason. The 2 years I spent caring for her, I gradually became familiar with Caroline White. She would reveal to me certain aspects of her stubborn and unyielding personality. For example, at certain moments, I would grit my teeth and swallow the scattered sounds, gripping her hair. If you can't see, then stop. Thrashing around, under the dim lights. The young woman tilted her head back slightly, soft bangs falling across her forehead, brushing past those glistening eyes. She licked her lips, her fingers pressed against my throat, gently pushing down, whispering, everything else is fine. So you need to speak louder for me to hear you. I snapped back to reality, made up an excuse to deal with Mr. Zhang. The next day at the office. The boss called me over. He spoke warmly. Vivian Foster. That popular emotional livestream show. You're going to prepare for it. You'll participate in the filming as an observing guest. It turned out that after I started working, the next episode of the show would be interviewing none other than Philip Foster and Caroline White. That day after the interview, news of their engagement appeared prominently on the trending search list, like a promotional launch for the show. Fans in the comments section went wild. Walking through hardship together, now meeting at the peak. What a beautiful love story. I heard the Chu family's company was half dead, but thanks to the White Corporation's strong support, it's risen again. A power couple. Only a fool wouldn't follow them. I scrolled through 10 lines at once, then closed the comments. The show host, Daniel Young, was confirming the script, while making small talk with me. If we could dig into the specific story of Ms. White's 2 years with her fiancé, the show's impact would definitely be excellent. I gripped the pen in my hand tightly, answering softly. Good. Everything that happened during those 2 years. Every detail I knew better than anyone. But I couldn't say it. Philip Foster, thanks to the White family's resources and connections, was now a rising A-list movie star. The show had just started. The livestream room was packed with millions of viewers. Under the stage lights, I heard Daniel Young speak. I heard Ms. White and Philip Foster have been discussing marriage. Could you share the emotional journey of you two? Philip Foster tilted his head to look at her, smiling faintly. All those vicious rumors about her back then. I never believed them. In my eyes, Caroline has always been the person I love most. He looked at her adoringly, his gaze so tender it could melt. Caroline White lowered her lashes and smiled. Liar. When I first went blind. During that time, how disgusted you were with me. Have you forgotten all of it? Philip Foster froze. His eyes flicked toward me beside him, flashing with malice several times. But in front of the camera, he could only force a smile. I don't remember very clearly. Probably because our relationship kept getting better. I only remember the sweet parts of our love. I scanned through the dense comments. Sickeningly sweet lines filling the entire screen. I set down the script, gripped the microphone tightly and asked Caroline White. It seems you two have slightly different perspectives. Or is there another reason? Why don't you tell us how you two reconciled? I thought she wouldn't answer. But after a moment of silence, Caroline White still spoke. During the time my eyes first had problems, I was extremely depressed, resenting the whole world, and I didn't like him either. He was out early and home late every day, and still had to take care of me in between. So busy every day he was dizzy. The fish stewing in the pot. He went downstairs to buy salt and forgot to turn off the stove. By the time he got back, the kitchen was already on fire. My throat felt like something was choking it. In my dazed mind, I felt like I could sense again that afternoon the scorching heat the flames brought, still lingering in the air. I dragged Caroline White out of the room, grabbed her by the collar, demanding fiercely, "Do you want to die?" My entire body and voice were shaking. She wasn't like before, fighting back and arguing with me. Instead, she stayed silent for a long, long time. Then asked me hoarsely, "Wouldn't my death be better? Wouldn't that be a relief for you too?" Maybe it was in that moment I suddenly realized that the once proud miss of the White family was now nothing more than a bluffing, depressed little kitten. So I pushed her into the room, breathing heavily. The wall where flames had licked was streaked with black. I unbuttoned her shirt one by one. "The doctor said I haven't had dinner yet. You owe me compensation." She seemed to realize something. "Think carefully about what comes next." I cut her off with a fierce kiss. "Swallow it down, Caroline White. I don't see you as a burden." That night felt like the entire world was spinning in chaos. With only us left, now she was bringing it up again. Her devoted fiancé sitting right beside her. And it was Philip. The whole world believed that it was their private memory. A suffocating feeling exploded in my chest. The distance was too close. From Caroline White's body came that familiar yet foreign scent, silently engulfing me, overwhelming but no longer belonging to me. She paused for a moment, then said amid the audience's applause. "I'll always remember the moonlight that night. So bright it illuminated everything. I couldn't see it, but I listened to him describe it all night long." I gripped the pen in my hand tightly, hurriedly lowering my head, my eyes stinging with pain, because I had changed the questions on the spot, asking about so many things no one had known before. This interview was a massive success. By the end of the show, the livestream room had exceeded 10 million viewers. For the first time extracting from the person who held power in the White family those secret, unspeakable details of the past. Everyone was thrilled. Backstage, Daniel Young clapped me on the shoulder. "Truly worthy of being a reporter. Those questions you changed on the spot were so sharp people couldn't help but answer them." But the moment I turned around, I saw Caroline White and Philip Foster approaching, and suddenly fell silent. Caroline White's cold gaze swept over. "Today's questions were prepared by you." I nodded. Philip Foster smiled mockingly. "Reporter Foster, you really know how to hit people where it hurts. But I have to remind you, you need to maintain basic professional ethics. Don't dream about things you don't deserve." I said nothing, only looked over at Caroline White. Her expression was cunning. She only said flatly, "Reporter Foster is very capable. From now on, you'll liaise directly with our company, handling media relations." Philip Foster stared at me silently, his eyes full of fear and hatred. He cornered me in an empty area, his gaze wary and disgusted. "Vivian Foster, you're truly insatiably greedy. You clearly took money from me back then. What are you coming back for now?" I looked at him calmly. "I graduated. I came back to work." A perfectly normal statement. Work. "Vivian Foster, do you think I'm stupid?" He suddenly screamed in my face like a madman. "Get lost right now. Tell her you're voluntarily requesting to give up the liaison position. Or don't expect a single good day ahead." I ignored him and turned to leave. Philip Foster did what he said he would. I suddenly started encountering obstacles everywhere. Several job opportunities that should have been mine were all suddenly replaced by others. That afternoon before leaving work, the boss suddenly called me into the office. "Next month, there's a very important annual development conference. You'll be the host." I was stunned for a moment, hearing him say Ms. White specifically requested you. After work, across from the company, a very familiar Rolls-Royce was parked. The tinted window rolled down, revealing Caroline White's cold expression. "Reporter Foster has been so curious about my past. Why not come ask me directly?" I lowered my head. I had no intention of prying into Ms. White's privacy. It was just what the job required. Even if it's for work. "I gave you my personal business card. You could have contacted me directly to ask." I pressed my lips together. It wasn't necessary, because in that moment, I suddenly realized this was 3 years later. She was Ms. White, who held immense power. Not that hot-tempered little kitten, who after being scolded, would pitifully cling to me and kiss me seeking comfort like that young girl once did. The Chu family had already issued their warning, without Caroline White's tacit approval and indulgence. Philip Foster absolutely wouldn't dare target me so openly. Perhaps to her, that past was actually something shameful, that she didn't want brought up. I was about to leave when Caroline White called me back. "Stop." She opened the car door. Her foot had barely stepped out before blocking my path. "Mr. Foster, let's talk," I asked hoarsely. "What does Ms. White want to say?" Caroline White curved her lips. Her gaze at me held a hint of helpless emotion. "Can we talk about work?" Over the next 2 weeks, Caroline White came to find me twice more, to go over the conference. Several important decisions that needed to be announced. Finally, as if suddenly remembering something, she handed me a document. A major tourism project not yet made public. In direct partnership with the state. You can announce it at the conference. Make it an exclusive scoop you've uncovered. I was silent for a moment, taking it and saying thank you. Mr. Zhang found out about this and kept advising me. I get the feeling Ms. White values you quite highly. Do you want to subtly tell her about Philip Foster pressuring you? I revised the hosting script, smiling. No need. Why would she make things difficult for her own fiancé? Over a stranger of a reporter? On the day of the conference. The venue was packed with people. The center seat where Caroline White should have been sitting was now empty. Countless stage lights flickered. I was announcing several important partnerships for the White Corporation's future, when suddenly an unfamiliar reporter stood up, loudly accusing me. Classified documents like that? Where did you steal them from? My expression went cold. My cooperation with the White Corporation has been completely legitimate and above board. Legitimate? Someone like you who climbed up through shady dealings is qualified to say such things? He shouted. I have proof right here. Someone walked onto the stage. It was Philip Foster. He looked at me and sighed softly. Vivian Foster. A small-time reporter like you. Being attracted to Caroline is quite normal. I originally wanted to give you some dignity. But you really won't shed tears until you see the coffin. The large screen behind us suddenly switched from the PPT to several provocative photos. And the person in the photos was me. You sent her these pictures. In the middle of the night wearing a bathrobe, knocking on her hotel room door. And there's surveillance of you and the boss entering the hotel. Following his words, the screen behind changed once more. The hotel door dimly lit. The boss and I walking in side by side. Someone like you. The entire hall erupted in chaos when the main entrance suddenly opened. Caroline White strode in. Her shrewd gaze swept across the entire venue, sweeping across my face too. Without pausing for even a moment, my heart silently sank. The stage lights shone down on me, like a public execution before thousands of eyes. For a moment the audience below buzzed with chatter. Something like this is just the scum of the journalism world. So despicable. Absolutely disgusting. Not a shred of professional ethics. Blacklist him. I didn't look at anyone. Only stared at Caroline White, watching her in a daze. Philip Foster said flatly. What did I just say? Philip Foster said, Caroline, he deceived you. He deliberately pretended to be a reporter to get close to you through interviews. It was to steal classified documents from you. To harm the entire White Corporation. Even this opportunity to host the conference was obtained through shady dealings. Caroline White was silent for a moment, looking at me. Do you have anything to say? Did I have anything to say? Under Philip Foster's gaze, I could feel his hatred and secret satisfaction, and suddenly felt utterly ridiculous. He and I were only 2 years apart. We were full biological siblings from the same parents. After our mother passed away, he and I should have been each other's only family left in this world. Our closest loved ones. I let out a mocking laugh, gripping the microphone tightly. I want to say, Ms. White, your fiancé is fabricating lies. Deliberately slandering me. If because you love him, you must turn a blind eye while he twists the truth. Fabricates reality. I will also write this story exactly as it happened into today's conference report. The public has eyes. If those in power can't distinguish right from wrong when developing projects, I'm afraid they can't be trusted either. Whether it was the stubborn and unyielding young lady from before, or the legendary figure now, who holds the power of life and death with decisive authority, hearing such a public threat should have made her furious. But she only walked through the lights, step by step onto the stage, standing at the same height, facing me from a distance. Using a very soft voice to call my name. Vivian Foster. My heart was suddenly flooded with an overwhelming ache. I didn't want to hear her make excuses for Philip Foster anymore. I turned my head away, speaking word by word. All the accusations against me above are nothing but baseless slander. Between me and Mr. Foster's fiancée, Ms. White, there has only been work correspondence. No private contact whatsoever. No contact. Before I could finish, Caroline White's voice suddenly cut me off. You gave me this ring. And now you won't take responsibility for me? I jerked my head to look at her in shock. She raised her left hand, revealing on her left ring finger that extremely simple silver ring, made of cheap material. The craftsmanship ordinary too, but because its owner had cherished it so carefully, under the lights it refracted brilliant, smooth light. This ring was like something, pulling me back to memories from 4 years ago. That day was supposed to be Caroline White's 19th birthday. The first 18 years of her life. Every birthday had been extravagant to the extreme, extraordinarily lively. Only this time she'd fallen so far that only I was by her side. To make her happy. During breaks from editing my thesis, I'd worked 2 extra days. Using the $200 I'd earned to buy a cheap pair of matching rings. When I got home, I took her hand and slipped it on. Caroline White couldn't see, but I could sense her ears turning completely red. She still forced herself to ask me, "What is this?" I teased her. There was a couple fighting on the street throwing things. I squatted there waiting half the day and picked up the ring. "Miss White, don't be disgusted by it. Don't call me that." Her movements were careful, as she clutched the cheap silver ring to her chest. "Even if it's something found, I still love it. Because you gave it to me." She did what she said. In all the days after that, she always wore that ring and never once took it off. Snapping back from the memory, Caroline White was walking toward me step by step. "Tell me, Vivian Foster." "There's nothing to say." I lowered my voice. "Ms. White has mistaken me for someone else." "Isn't this ring from your fiancé, Mr. Foster, a token of love he gave you?" She let out a mocking sound. "Did I say where this ring came from? How do you know so clearly?" By the time she finished speaking, she was standing right in front of me. The distance so close it was impossible to avoid. Below the stage, whispers. "What does this mean?" Ms. White is saying the person who weathered those difficult times with her was actually that small-time reporter. Then what's Philip Foster? Not to be rude, but the two of them really do look quite alike. Philip Foster stared at me with hatred, but couldn't help softening his voice to coax Caroline White. "Caroline, don't let him deceive you. This person has always been full of lies. He has a criminal record." I closed my eyes, pushing down all the surging emotions in my chest. When I opened them, I could look at her calmly and without turbulence. "I gave it to you. Back then, for money. I impersonated Philip Foster and deceived you for 2 years. Then I took the money and left. I've already forgotten about what happened back then. Because from the beginning, you thought that person was Philip Foster. And you've already gotten engaged to him. What's the point of correcting it now?" I couldn't continue speaking. I swallowed down the slight catch in my voice. Taking several deep breaths, I set down the microphone and prepared to leave. The moment I turned, my wrist was caught. Skin pressed against skin. From her palm came that familiar warmth. Her voice slowly rang out. "Of course it matters. You said as long as I wore the ring you gave me, no matter where I went, you'd recognize me at once. Does that promise still count?" My vision blurred intensely. I lowered my eyes, hiding all emotion in my voice, burying it deep in my throat, bit by bit prying open her fingers, withdrawing my hand. When I looked up, my expression was silent. I forgot, I already said I was lying. Actually, during those years studying abroad, I was always thinking of Caroline White. In the winter when she turned 19, when she was about to return to the White family. That was the peak of our passionate love. The northern city's winter was desperately dry. Even kissing would spark static electricity. A slight stinging pain. It wasn't that I never thought about being honest with her about my identity. There were many moments when emotions ran deep. She would kiss my ear and call me hoarsely, "Philip, don't abandon me." Like a bucket of ice water suddenly dumped over my head. I suddenly realized then, from the beginning, my coming to her side had been with unspeakable motives. Replacing someone else. Caroline White once told me. When I was little, my cousin tricked me into a cabinet, locked the door, and I nearly died inside. For the rest of my life, I hate nothing more than being deceived. If she knew the truth, would she hate me to the bone too? Before Caroline White's 20th birthday, the old patriarch of the White family fell gravely ill. He accidentally discovered the truth from back then. That Caroline White had been deliberately framed from the start. Even the car accident had been pre-arranged. He had people contact Philip Foster to bring Caroline White home. Philip Foster came to find me. He was already a very famous movie star. Chin raised, looking down at me arrogantly. Now the White family wants to take her back. You're not still dreaming of climbing the social ladder, are you? Stop dreaming. Whether it's the White family or Caroline White, they only recognize me. Philip Foster. You were only ever a cheap knockoff. He pulled a check from his pocket and threw it at me. Here's another 500,000 for you. Stop having unrealistic dreams, or I'll tell everyone everything that happened back then. I silently looked up at him. Philip. My mother was your mother too. My mother was the young lady of the Chu family. What does she count as? He let out a mocking sound. Just a prostitute. I lost control, grabbed Philip Foster by the collar, and punched him twice viciously. Hearing the commotion, someone rushed in from outside, twisted my arm and pinned me to the ground. The movie star stood before me, looking down at me from above. Was I wrong? Take the money and obediently get lost abroad. Don't come out and be an eyesore anymore, or I'll have people carve all those sordid things from back then onto her gravestone. He left. I stared at the check as it drifted lightly to the ground, thinking about 2 years before when Mom fell ill. The family had borrowed so much debt. After she passed away, I couldn't even afford a proper gravestone. Right then, Philip Foster contacted me wanting money. Before I'd even finished speaking, he let out a mocking laugh. She only raised me for a few days. Dead is dead. Why should I give her money? I thought he still harbored resentment and wanted to explain. That day Dad wanted custody of you. You were the one who cried and followed Dad. Of course I had to follow Dad to the Chu family. Did you think I was as stupid as you? Philip Foster cut me off coldly. So what? You people still wanted to keep me around. Living poor and wretched like you. Dead without even being able to afford a gravestone? I looked at Philip Foster in front of me. All the words stuck at the edge of my throat. I couldn't utter a single one. That face that looked 60 to 70% like mine. Full of unwillingness and disgust. The expensive suit on his body. Diamond cufflinks at his wrists. Any single item he wore was a luxury I could barely imagine. He picked up the coffee cup on the table and took a leisurely sip, finally revealing his true intentions. But for the sake of our brotherhood, if you want money, it's not like I can't give you 500,000. You play my identity and take my place caring for someone. The conference venue that had now turned into a showdown. Looking at those present, the gazes at him grew increasingly strange. Some even turned their microphones and cameras toward him. Mr. Foster, may I ask if what Ms. White just said is true? The person who was with her during her difficult times back then really wasn't you, but was this reporter over here. May I ask if all your accusations earlier were all slander? He couldn't defend himself. Could only look to Caroline White for help. Caroline, you know me best. I've been with you for so many years. How could I do something like this? Caroline White lowered her eyes to look at him below the stage, smiling faintly. Don't be afraid. Aren't you authentic proof? The lawyers have already arrived. Everything today will be recorded exactly as evidence. Her voice was gentle and soothing, as if consoling him. But Philip Foster looked at her as if seeing a terrifying monster. Suddenly trembling all over, the conference couldn't continue. I gathered the hosting script and turned to leave the stage. Caroline White silently followed behind me. It's raining outside. Let me give you a ride home. The rain poured down like buckets. I thought for 3 seconds, and still decided not to waste my own time getting into Caroline White's Rolls Royce. I tilted my head to look over, seeing in her eyes a few hints of hidden joy. But when I took out my phone, I discovered what had just happened at the conference had been live-streamed to the world, shooting to the trending searches, with netizens arguing fiercely under several topics. So, Philip Foster claimed credit for what that small-time reporter did. How shameless is that? What do you mean claimed credit? This kind of man who climbed up through shady dealings. Who knows who's really lying? It's already been verified. Those provocative photos were photoshopped. Even if it really was him, he was paid to do a job from the start. The job's done, the money's been taken. What does he have to feel wronged about? Am I the only one who feels bad for Caroline White? Neither of these men is any good. Both of them deceived her. Reading this, my heart suddenly felt like something was lodged in it. I quickly turned off my phone and looked up. Rainwater formed small rivers blocking the windshield. The lights outside retreated rapidly, blending into a chaotic, brilliant blur of colors. Compared to 3 years ago, this city's scenery hadn't changed at all. But between Caroline White and me, everything had been completely overturned. Back then, the White family invited the most renowned specialists. After 2 surgeries, Caroline White finally had her sight restored. Philip Foster paid a high price for bodyguards, who watched me 24 hours a day. Strict surveillance, afraid I would meet Caroline White and tell her the truth. Yet on the day she recovered her sight, they actually brought me to the hospital. Outside the hospital room door, I couldn't see Caroline White, but I could hear her anxious voice. "Philip. Caroline, I'm here." Philip Foster lowered his voice. "I was really so worried about you." His voice deliberately altered, almost completely identical to mine. Caroline White didn't notice anything unusual. Just opened her mouth slightly unhappily. "You said, when I recovered my sight, you wanted to be the first person I saw. You broke your promise." I didn't listen to what came after. A violent pain suddenly surged in my chest, nearly swallowing me whole. From the beginning, in Caroline White's world, the person who accompanied her through those 2 years was Philip Foster. There was no me, no Vivian Foster. Philip Foster's bodyguard dragged me into the adjacent lounge. Before long he walked in, his expression still as arrogant as ever. Only his lips had a small bleeding wound from Caroline White's kiss. "She really does love me. Can't bear to be apart from me," he told me slowly. "These 2 years you took care of her very well. But to her, it was all me who did it. Someone of lowly status like you can never have anything to do with her. Where are you going? Home?" Caroline White's voice suddenly rang out, interrupting my memories. I lowered my head slightly. Could Ms. White drop me at the office? I still have some work to handle. But she didn't start the car. Instead, leaned one hand on the steering wheel and turned toward me, her expression looking somewhat sad. "Vivian Foster. Do you really have to use such distant terms to address me? So close, barely inches away." That familiar scent from her body, mixed with the smell of rain, invaded and wrapped around me, almost dragging me back into countless memories of the past. In this moment I suddenly didn't want to hold back anymore. I pushed her away and looked over coldly. "Then what do you want me to call you? Should I call you Miss or Caroline White? Do you want it to be like 3 years ago, when I got hurt protecting you, and you screamed Philip's name at me?" She suddenly fell silent. "Those 2 years are over. The person engaged to you from start to finish was Philip Foster. Your life has returned to its proper track. What are you bothering me for?" "But this isn't my track." Caroline White looked at me, the corners of her eyes gradually reddening. I'd never met Philip Foster before. From the beginning, the only person I recognized was you. A dense pain welled up from within my chest. I closed my eyes, opening my mouth, my voice trembling uncontrollably. "You're still lying to me. Caroline White, the day you recovered your sight, I was outside the hospital room. I heard you accept Philip Foster as me without a shred of doubt. Embracing and kissing him." She suddenly interrupted me. The first second I opened my eyes, I already knew he wasn't you. I suddenly froze, hearing Caroline White's voice, calm and steady. The White family situation was very complicated. In that hospital room that day, there was more than one person with malicious intentions, who wanted me dead. So the moment I realized he wasn't you, I decided Philip Foster would be the best and most perfect human shield. She curved her lips, the smile in her eyes carrying a cold, sharp quality. "Doesn't he love impersonating and replacing others? Then let him replace me thoroughly." In my mind suddenly, several news alerts flashed by. From when I was studying for my master's abroad, they said Philip Foster encountered a real explosion while filming, nearly buried in a sea of flames, and that he went traveling with Caroline White, when a massive billboard fell and injured him, nearly killing him. It wasn't intentional that I didn't recognize you these 3 years. A lot has actually happened. After grandfather passed away, one by one, members of the White family jumped out wanting to kill me. But now they're either in prison, or 6 feet under. Among them was even my own mother. Actually, I'm not afraid of dying either. My cousin was forced to give up all his shares. And in his madness stabbed me. I didn't even feel the pain. In that moment I only missed you terribly. The parking lot was silent on all sides. Under the dim car lights. She removed her outer coat, revealing the scar near her heart on her chest. The White family was too chaotic. It wasn't easy to obtain. But it's okay. After today, Philip Foster and the last forces that propped him up should all come crashing down. The entire White family, including me, can all be yours. She drew closer bit by bit, at a distance barely inches away, staring at me intently. In the past, those eyes were always gray and clouded. Now, they shone bright as if containing the entire starry universe. I swallowed hard, lowering my voice. But you've been with Philip Foster. I never kissed him. Never. She emphasized slightly. In my entire life, I've only ever kissed you. Just that one sentence. The thread of reason in my mind snapped completely. I lunged forward and grabbed her collar. Countless passionate memories from the past surged up in my chest. Her difficult period was also the two most turbulent and uncertain years. The most confused and helpless time of my entire life. All those restless emotions with nowhere to go. In the end, transformed into endless entanglement between us. By the time the wind stopped and the rain cleared, it was already late at night. Caroline White drove to a villa. I took out my phone and saw on the trending searches a piece of news highlighted in red. Breaking. Philip Foster taken in for investigation. Last month, my half-brother contacted me. He knew my secret, threatening to steal bidding documents from me and other classified materials. I was silent for a moment, speaking softly. I knew you knew. Caroline White suddenly turned her head. Did you arrange it? Vivian Foster. I nodded, squeezing my own palm, forcing myself to stare at her. This time I came back specifically to destroy the Chu family. To destroy Philip Foster. Because 20 years ago, the Chu family framed my mother with false accusations. For this outcome, I'm willing to pay any price. I work in media. This is the most important reason. 20 years ago, because she liked my father. The young miss of the Chu family conspired to frame my mother, saying she was a prostitute, and Philip Foster was still young. To live the life of a young master. He helped outsiders, personally pushing his own mother into the abyss. My mother was detained for 15 days. Lost her job too. When she came home, all the neighbors pointed fingers at her, taking my father's side. After my parents divorced, my mother carried that shameful reputation, taking me back to the countryside in disgrace. She became depressed and melancholy, barely past 50 when she died from illness. And on the day she died, the hospital TV was broadcasting news about the Chu family, saying the Chu couple was harmonious with excellent children, a model even among elite families. How ridiculous. My mother weighed less than 70 pounds when she died, the backs of her hands full of bruised needle marks. She could have lived to 100. The Chu family's business dealings weren't clean either. How many people have they harmed? And they're worthy of being called a model? I covered my eyes, pushing down the tears surging violently. Caroline White, I used you. Because I knew you wouldn't forgive betrayal. So I deliberately let him violate your trust. If you feel hurt because of this, hate me if you want, it doesn't matter. But I have to personally send him to hell. I pushed down all my emotions, making myself look at her as calmly as possible. But Vivian Foster, your hands are shaking. Caroline White took my hand hidden behind my back, carefully bringing it to her lips, and kissed it. Don't be afraid. You used me. I'm too happy for words. That proves I exist in your heart. Of course I'll stand by your side. I already told you, including me, the entire White family belongs to you. The news of Philip Foster being taken in for investigation dominated the trending searches for 3 days. The Chu family wanted to suppress public opinion, so they turned to Caroline White for help. She sat behind her desk, listened to their requests, and smiled. What you're saying is very touching. But how to handle this matter? I'm sorry, but my fiancé has to decide. My father, accompanied by his elite wife, turned and saw me. His expression immediately changed. I smiled faintly at them. You two better prepare quickly. Because very soon you'll be just like him. Caroline White called a press conference to clarify the relationship between her and Philip Foster. Facing questions, she smiled without smiling. Fiancé. I never acknowledged him as such. I said, it's always been the person who stayed by my side and cared for me back then. Someone asked, but wasn't he only there because he took money from Philip Foster to take care of you? Caroline White's lips still held a smile, but her eyes gradually turned cold. This reporter. I advise you to be careful with your words. There are so many rich people in this world. Why would he only take money to care for me? Wasn't it because he loved me? The reporter fell silent. Sitting beside her, I also remained silent. After this press conference ended, I released several audio recordings from back then, when he came to find me. A blind woman, who's also a wealthy wife. Who would want to take care of her? She only raised me for a few days. Dead is dead. Why should I give her money? You people still wanted to keep me around. Living poor and wretched like you. Dead without even being able to afford a gravestone? Public opinion erupted. That can't be right. Why do I remember? His character was always supposed to be noble and generous. A movie star. So he and Vivian Foster are biological brothers. And he was the one who actively found someone to replace him. Designer clothes from head to toe. Worth over 100,000 combined. Can't even pay for his own mother's gravestone. Absolutely disgusting. I rode this wave of public opinion and started a live stream. In front of millions of people, I revealed the truth from 20 years ago. Miss of the Chu family, Jennifer Chu, liked my father. They refused to come clean and get divorced. Instead, conspired together to frame my mother, forcing her to carry that shameful reputation. Living in humiliation for the rest of her life. Standing behind me was a man with a shaved head, hunched over. During my master's degree and internship, I asked around everywhere, spent so much effort, before finally finding this person's whereabouts. Through a classmate from my department. He had a habit of petty theft, and later went to prison several times. That incident back then was ordered by Jennifer Chu. Miss Gu was truly innocent. She was tricked by her son into attending a party at the Chu residence. When she was drunk, I helped her to a room. Money was stuffed under the pillow. Jennifer Chu had already called the police before my mother, who'd been deliberately drugged, could wake up. The door was already thrown open by a swarm of people. Even now, falsely accusing a woman of prostitution. Branding her with that label as easy as flipping your hand. Let alone back in that era. I studied communications. I work in media. Not just because of this case. I'll spend the rest of my life giving all those who've been wronged their vindication and justice. This live stream added the final fire to bring down the Chu family. Their methods of getting rich were never clean from the start. Now under strict investigation. It was like walking straight into a loaded gun. Originally from the beginning, I wasn't helping them. It was my half-brother. Caroline White said, it was just a few project collaborations. We could withdraw at any time. No need to worry about affecting me. I finally felt at ease. All the evidence I'd collected over the years, I submitted completely to the police. Thanks to Caroline White taking over the White family. She'd cut ties with those people very cleanly. She wasn't implicated. The Chu family completely collapsed. That day I held a bouquet of flowers and brought Caroline White to the cemetery to visit my mother. In the photo on the gravestone, her smile was still gentle, but always carried a hint of sorrow. She was a kind and gentle woman who truly loved my father. So for many years she couldn't move on. On the day before she died, lying in that hospital bed, she gripped my hand tightly, telling me not to blame Philip Foster. She said he wasn't blood of the Chu family. Living there must have been very difficult. She didn't know that all these years, Philip Foster had always belittled and insulted her, currying favor with Jennifer Chu, gradually establishing his position in the Chu family. From the day he stepped into the Chu household, he began to rot. I looked at the photo on the gravestone. Mom, what happened back then? No one will ever think you were at fault again. Now I have a good career. And I have a girlfriend too. Caroline White stood beside me, correcting in a low voice. I'm your future wife. Right, my future wife. I unconsciously twisted the silver ring on my left ring finger, matching with Caroline White's. When I went abroad that year, I'd hidden it at the bottom of a trunk, thinking that for the rest of my life, I'd never have the chance to wear it again. I arranged the bouquet in front of the gravestone, stood up, bowed, and turned around. The end.